Ladies and gentlemen, a legend of cinema, actor, director, and a man who always speaks his mind, Robert De Niro. Proclaimed Colbert. "Bob, you look like you just rapped Taxi Driver 2, Colbert joked, eliciting laughter. "Maybe I'm just gearing up for a real fight," De Niro replied with a faint smile. His voice was low, but it carried strength. Colbert dove right into the main topic. "So, Bob, everyone's talking about the new Pope, Leo XIV. The first American in the role, Robert Francis Prevost from Chicago. His election on May 8th was a sensation. But his statements about returning to moral foundations are already stirring controversy. What do you think of him?" "You know, Stephen, I grew up in New York, in an Italian family. The church was everywhere, Sunday masses, my grandmother's talks. But I never bought into what was forced on me. This new pope, he talks about morality. But whose morality? For him, homosexuality is a challenge. Women should know their place. That doesn't sound like the America I know. It sounds like a step backward." "You're touching on a sensitive topic," Colbert said. "Leo XIV has Italian roots, like you. And he's from Chicago, where you filmed The Untouchables. Maybe you have something in common?" De Niro snorted. "In common? I made movies about people fighting the system. Raging Bull, Cape Fear, they're about those society breaks. This pope wants to build new walls. He talks about unity, but who's he uniting? Only those who agree with him." Suddenly, a shout rang out from the audience. The voice was hoarse, with a Brooklyn accent. "Shame on you." What happened after these words shocked all the viewers on the show, so don't switch. Everyone turned. A man in his mid-60s, wearing a checkered shirt, stood trembling with anger. His face was red, his eyes blazing with indignation. Studio security tensed, but Colbert motioned for them to hold off. "Wait, let's talk," he said, standing up. "Sir, what's your name?" "Frank Russo," the man replied, still standing. "I've been a Catholic my whole life, and I won't let some actor smear our pope." The audience buzzed. Some clapped for Frank, others whistled. De Niro turned to him, his gaze calm but firm. "Frank, I'm not smearing your faith," he said. "I'm saying the church should listen to everyone, not just those who pray the way it wants. You're from Brooklyn, right? You know what struggle is. Why do you want the church telling your neighbors how to live?" Frank took a step forward, his voice growing louder. "Because it's right. Pope Leo protects family, tradition. And you, De Niro, you're just a rich liberal who doesn't get how regular people live. You sit in your mansion while I lost my job because of your progressive ideas." The audience erupted in shouts. Some yelled, "Sit down, Frank," others, "Bravo, Frank." De Niro stood from his chair, his face impassive but his eyes burning. "Frank, I grew up on the streets of New York," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "My grandfather busted his back on construction sites for pennies. Don't tell me I don't know how regular people live. I'm saying the church should be for everyone, for you, your neighbor, your son, even if he doesn't fit into tradition. Do you want your son to feel like an outsider in his own country?" Frank clenched his fists, his voice breaking. "My son. Don't you dare talk about my son. You don't know what we've been through. The church is all we have left, and you want to tear it down. All right, gentlemen, let's take a deep breath," Colbert said, raising his hands. "Frank, Bob, you're both passionate, and that's great. But let's continue after a short break. We'll be right back after the commercial." "Frank, why don't you take a seat?" said Colbert, trying to defuse the tension. "I'm not sitting down until he apologizes." He jabbed a finger toward De Niro. "You call yourself a champion of regular people? Do you know what your words do to us? You're tearing us apart, De Niro. My priest in Brooklyn says Pope Leo is our chance to bring back morality, and you're spitting on it." The audience buzzed. Some clapped for Frank, others whistled. A woman in her 60s in the front row, with a gray bun and a cross necklace, shouted, "Tell him, Frank. The church is our salvation." De Niro slowly stood, his gaze cold but composed. He took a step toward the edge of the stage, closer to Frank. "Frank, I'm not spitting on your faith," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm saying the church has no right to decide who's worthy of love and who isn't. Your Pope Leo calls homosexuality a challenge. What's he going to say about your son? He doesn't fit into his morality, does he?" Frank flinched as if struck. His face contorted, and for a moment it seemed he might lunge at De Niro. The audience fell silent, even the crew froze. Colbert jumped up but couldn't intervene in time. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare talk about my son," Frank shouted, his voice breaking. "You don't know anything about him. He's a good kid, but the church. It gives us hope." De Niro leaned closer, his eyes blazing but his voice steady. "Frank, if the church makes your son feel like an outsider, that's not hope. That's a cage. And I won't let people like Leo the 14th lock up the people I know. The people you know." Suddenly, another voice cut through from the back of the audience, younger, sharp, with a slight tremble. "Dad, enough." Everyone turned. A young man, about 30, with short dark hair and a denim jacket, stood in the aisle. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with determination. He looked like Frank, the same nose, the same stubborn jawline. The audience gasped, and even Colbert looked stunned. Frank spun around, his eyes widening. "Michael?" he rasped. "What are you doing here?" Michael stepped forward, his hands trembling, but his gaze fixed on his father. "I came because I knew you'd be here. I heard you talking to Mom about this show, about how you wanted to defend the church. But, Dad, I can't stay silent anymore. I'm gay, and I'm not a challenge for your pope. I'm your son." The father's reaction will make you think, so don't switch. The audience erupted in shouts. Some clapped, others whispered, unable to believe their ears. Frank stood rooted to the spot, his face a mix of shock and pain. De Niro stepped back, his gaze softening, but he stayed silent, giving Michael space. Colbert, sensing the moment was beyond a typical show, quickly stepped in. All right, this is a powerful moment," he said, his voice soft but professional. "Michael, thank you for sharing. Frank, Bob, I think we all need a moment to process this. We'll be back after the commercial, and I promise we'll continue this conversation." Frank stared at Michael, his lips trembling, but he said nothing. Michael stood, clenching his fists, his eyes glistening with tears, but he held his ground. De Niro returned to his chair, but his gaze remained fixed on Frank and Michael. He knew he had just witnessed something that could change not only their lives, but the perspectives of many in the audience. In the green room, where Frank and Michael were ushered, the air was heavy. Frank sat in a chair, his hands shaking. Michael stood by the door, not daring to come closer. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Frank finally rasped, his voice full of pain. Michael swallowed, his eyes welling up. "Because I knew you'd choose the church over me." Frank fell silent, his face contorting. At that moment, the door opened and De Niro walked in. He paused, looking at both of them. "I don't want to intrude," he said. "But Frank, your son just did the bravest thing I've seen in a long time. Don't turn away from him." Frank looked up, his voice trembling. "You don't understand, De Niro. It's not that simple. The church. It's all I've got." De Niro crouched in front of him, his gaze soft but piercing. "The church isn't your son. And if Leo the 14th is making you choose between them, maybe that's not the church, it's something else." Michael took a step forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "Dad, I don't want you to choose. I just want you to hear me." Frank closed his eyes, his shoulders trembling. In the studio, the crew prepared to go back on air, while the audience buzzed, discussing what had just happened. Colbert stood by the stage, holding his cue cards, but he knew the script had gone out the window. Whatever happened after the commercial, this show had already become something far greater than entertainment. "Welcome back," he began, his voice warm but cautious. "Before the break, we witnessed a deeply emotional moment. Frank Russo, our audience member, and Robert De Niro got into a heated discussion about the new Pope, Leo the 14th, and his views. Then Michael, Frank's son, took a bold step by sharing his story. Frank and Michael are with us now. Let's give them a warm welcome. The audience erupted in applause as Frank and Michael walked onto the stage. Frank looked older than he had half an hour ago, his shoulders slumped, his gray hair disheveled, his eyes avoiding his son's gaze. Michael walked beside him, his denim jacket trembling slightly from nervous tension, but he held his head high. Robert De Niro sat in the guest chair, his face impassive, but his eyes tracked every move Frank and Michael made. Colbert gestured for them to sit on the couch next to De Niro. Frank sat as far from Michael as possible, his hands gripping his knees. Michael looked at his father, his eyes glistening with tears, but he remained silent. "Frank, Michael, thank you for coming back," said Colbert, sitting at his desk. "I know this isn't easy. Bob, you started this conversation by criticizing Pope Leo XIV's views. Want to add anything before we continue?" "Stephen, I've said all I think about Leo XIV. He's building walls, not bridges. But this isn't about him anymore. It's about Frank and Michael. And about everyone watching who thinks the church is more important than their kids." The audience clapped, but Frank sharply raised his hand, silencing them. "Enough, De Niro." His voice trembled with anger and pain. "You stand here on this stage, lecturing me on how to be a father? You don't know what I've been through. My wife died 5 years ago, and the church was the only thing keeping me afloat. And now you, and—" He glanced at Michael but didn't finish, his voice breaking. Michael leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Dad, I don't want you to choose between me and the church. I just want you to hear me. I'm gay, and I can't change who I am. But I'm still your son. Why can't you accept that?" Frank closed his eyes, his hands trembling. The audience fell silent, and even Colbert, who usually knew how to lighten the mood with a joke, stayed quiet. De Niro turned to Frank, his gaze soft but piercing. "Frank, I'm not your son's father," he said. "But I've seen people lose those they love because of prejudice. A friend of mine, an actor I knew in the 70s, died of AIDS because society turned its back on him. The church turned its back. I don't want Michael to feel that." Frank shot up, his face flushed. "Don't compare my son to your stories," he shouted. "You don't know what it's like to fear your son won't get to heaven. Pope Leo says homosexuality is a sin, and I don't know how to live with that." The audience buzzed, some shouting support for Frank, others for Michael. Colbert raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd. "All right, let's all take a breath," he said. "Frank, I understand this is hard. Michael, you were incredibly brave. Bob, maybe there's something we can all do too. Well, find some common ground." De Niro looked at Frank, then at Michael. He stood and walked to the couch, stopping in front of them. "Frank, I'm not saying you're a bad father," he said. "I'm saying your son is standing here, begging you to hear him. Leo XIV can say whatever he wants, but he's not here. Michael is. And he's not asking for much, just your love." Michael swallowed, his eyes welling up. Frank stood, clenching his fists, his gaze darting between De Niro and his son. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "Michael, I don't know how to accept this. The church taught me it's wrong. But I don't want to lose you. I lost your mom, and—" His voice broke, and he fell silent. Michael stood and gently placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, I don't need the church to know you love me. Just say you'll try." Frank looked at him, his eyes full of tears. He didn't respond but gave a slight nod, a gesture more eloquent than words. The audience erupted in applause, and even Colbert, who rarely lost his composure, looked moved. This is why we do this show," he said, his voice trembling. "Frank, Michael, Bob, thank you for your honesty. I think we've all been given something to think about." De Niro returned to his chair, but, before sitting, quietly said to Frank, "If you ever want to talk, I'm in New York. No cameras." Frank nodded, this time more confidently. Colbert stood to wrap up the show. "Ladies and gentlemen, This was one of the most powerful shows we've ever done. Let's give another round of applause for Robert De Niro, Frank, and Michael Russo. The audience gave a standing ovation as the theme music played. The cameras cut, but the conversations in the studio didn't stop. Audience members left, discussing how Michael's and De Niro's words made them reflect on their own families, faith, and society. On social media, the show was already being called historic, with clips of Michael's speech racking up millions of views. Frank and Michael stayed in the green room. Frank sat, holding a glass of water an assistant had brought him. Michael stood nearby, not daring to speak. "I can't promise I'll understand everything right away," Frank finally said, his voice quiet. "But I'll try. For you." Michael smiled, his eyes welling up. "That's all I'm asking, Dad." Outside the studio, De Niro stood by the exit, looking at the New York sky, where clouds parted to let through the evening sun. He knew Leo the 14th, and his views would continue to divide people. But today, in this studio, one man took a small step toward his son.